Hello, everybody. Really good to see you here. First of all, could people see my screen? I'm sharing a presentation.
Yes, I can see it.
Yes. Okay. I will assume if Mark can see it, then everybody can. So yes, thank you very much. I see the chats coming in. Just to follow on what Mark said, very often it's tempting for us in the IT business to think, especially in this day and age, that things are fairly settled, things are fairly well understood, fairly well known. When you talk about the cloud, that's been around for a long time, and people are very familiar with it, and it's working fairly stably and so on. I want to point out that actually the IT industry as a whole is relatively new. And there are parts in our industry which are really emerging. They're being innovated as we talk. And cloud is actually one of those. It is not as mature as we might think. There is still a lot of people who are experiencing this for the first time. There is still a lot of experimentation with how cloud is being used. And in many senses, cloud is really at the cutting edge of where the IT industry is today. Those of you who are involved in using and managing cloud services are really pioneers in a very real sense. The work that we're doing now will be a foundation for what comes next. So I really want to point that out first of all. A lot of this information is new. There are very few hard and fast rules when it comes to cloud management. It's still emerging. We're still learning. And this book is really just a snapshot of what we have learned up until this point. So I'm going to go through the slides. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion when necessary. We're going to start by looking at what promises have been made either by cloud service providers or people who have put business cases together to use the cloud. And then I want to look at some of the realities of that situation. So here are some of the promises. We have learned that there are a number of cost benefits to using cloud, that cloud will save you money. And that is certainly true. It certainly can save you money. However, only 34% of organizations who use the cloud experience the significant cost benefit or the anticipated cost benefit. In terms of speed to market, using cloud, very, very fast, very easy to adapt using cloud, easier to bring to the market new products, new services, but in fact, only 28% of organizations have achieved the anticipated speed to market benefits. As far as service levels go, we believe and we are told and we hope that cloud services, because they are so highly available and adaptable and flexible, will allow us to achieve improvements in our service levels. And what we found is that only a third of organizations have actually achieved that. And then finally, business value. Again, a lot of organizations saying, well, we'd rather go straight to the cloud than work with our IT department to develop something in-house because it's faster, it's easier, and so on. But only 35% of organizations have reached those objectives. And this data comes from a number of sources, which we've listed down there. The point of this is that this is not just about the cloud services. It's very easy to say, well, cloud doesn't work because organizations are not achieving the benefits. In fact, cloud does work. That has been proven by at least 70 to 75% of organizations, by at least a third of organizations that try it. The question is, what did they do that made them successful? And what is going wrong with the other 70 to 75% of organizations who are not achieving those benefits? That was part of the question that we started looking at when we started writing the book. And again, I'm the lead editor, not the main author, although I did author parts of it. There was a whole team of people that came together, and part of that team were people from consumer organizations, and part of that team were people from the actual cloud service providers. So as a group, we sat together and looked at what the issues are that are causing this situation. And what we found is that the biggest barriers, were these. First of all, security, and the huge misalignment in expectations about what cloud security means. Again, we find that cloud service providers will say that their environments are extremely secure, and they're right. What we don't realize is that how we use those cloud services can be extremely insecure, even though they're based on the cloud, even though they're used in the cloud. And so security becomes this major learning curve. How do we secure services in the cloud? 77% of organizations find that to be their biggest stumbling block. The second one is cloud spend. As I said, it is possible to save money in the cloud, but most organizations don't achieve that cost saving. 76% of them find that managing cloud spend has become a challenge. So one of the biggest questions we had to ask is, why does cloud spend become such a big challenge, and what do we do about it? Lack of expertise and knowledge, and this is really interesting. If you look at the number of certifications that each cloud service provider offers to be able to use their cloud service effectively, they run into probably 100. That somebody has to learn to become a certified architect at any particular cloud technology. So while cloud is really supposed to be seamless and easy to use, and it is, to be able to get there, you need to have people who are qualified and who understand the architecture and are able to work with it effectively. And that is an issue, that there are not enough people with that kind of knowledge to enable us to manage cloud services effectively in many cases. Governance and control, and I'm going to talk about this in quite a bit of detail later, is a major issue, and that has to do with how you control the use of cloud, making sure that it is used appropriately, that it is used in an authorized manner, and that only people who have authorization have access to certain kind of assets in the cloud, including data, etc. We'll talk about that later. And then a number of others, which I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but all of these are addressed in some detail in this book, and I will give you an overview of some of the ways in which we've addressed them. But before we talk about solutions to cloud and barriers to cloud success and how to overcome them, there are a couple of things we need to know about cloud before we start. And one thing that we learned as we were putting this book together, as we were writing it and researching for it, is that a number of organizations have a fundamental misunderstanding about what the cloud is and where and how it should be used. So I want to clarify some of those things. So before we even start talking about adopting cloud and migrating to cloud and so on, a couple of things that are really important to understand about the cloud. And this diagram it comes from the Digital and IT Strategy book. We used it again in the cloud book. And it was one which I developed some years ago. I was still working at HP when I started seeing how people were using technology, and I started seeing a trend in how certain components were being outsourced. We hadn't yet got to the cloud. We were still in an outsourced situation, and this is what happens. So typically an organization will be innovative. It comes up with a new product, new service, a new way of doing things, a way to become more efficient, or a way to operate more effectively. And they're highly innovative when they do that. The thing about innovation is that it really puts you ahead. It puts you ahead of where you were previously. It can even, and hopefully does, put you ahead of your competitors. It makes you unique as an organization. But the thing about innovation is that it is very short-lived. Because for an innovation to be effective, it has to be delivered consistently at a certain level of quality. People are very patient with innovation in the early days. They're excited by it because it's new. But if it keeps failing, and it fails to deliver on what it says it's going to deliver, they will very soon move to something else, and that innovation will no longer be there. And the market is littered with really good ideas, but which just were, the organizations were not able to deliver on them effectively. So there's a bit of an issue here, because to be able to deliver effectively on innovation, you have to teach people how to manage it and how to deliver it effectively, which means it becomes part of your core operation as an organization. When it becomes part of a core operation, it becomes repeatable, it becomes consistent. More and more people get to understand how to deliver it and support it. At a certain point, there are so many people who have this capability and this knowledge and this skill that it becomes this, what used to be highly innovative now becomes a commodity, because if anybody can do it, pretty soon everybody does it. So, the one that's probably one that sits in my mind, because I lived through it, was the whole ERP revolution, or ERM revolution, enterprise resource planning or enterprise resource management, where a number of organizations started using enterprise resource planning applications, software, as a way of getting their pipeline working more efficiently and effectively. And as a result, they were able to be very competitive. Well, today, not only is ERP, you have to have ERP if you're in any kind of supply chain. It's a given. There is no way you can survive in the industry without some form of ERP. And in fact, it's become such a commodity that ERP applications are now available in the cloud, and they're commoditized. A lot of those ERP activities have become commodities that are just offered out there. And that's the point. When something becomes a commodity and everybody or a number of people are offering it, it becomes something that is cheap and efficient. Why would we want to spend a whole lot of money and time and effort doing it in-house when it's freely available in the industry? And so something that is a commodity becomes a very good candidate for outsourcing. And this is exactly what cloud is about. Cloud operates really effectively between the commoditized and the source. The typical service that you get in the cloud, now not all of them, but the typical service that you get in the cloud is a commoditized service. It is not something that is innovative. It is things like service. It is things like application that is tried and tested and in use by pretty much everybody in the industry. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are some components of the cloud which are highly innovative, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But for the most part, the reason you want to use the cloud is because you can get a commoditized service from outside the organization for much cheaper and with much less of a headache than it costs you to do inside your organization. So that's the first thing we need to understand about cloud, that it is a commodity. 99.9% of the time, the reason you're using cloud is because it is a commoditized service. The result is that, cloud service is not something that is tailored to your specific environment. You want to tailor a cloud service. There are ways you can do that, but typically that introduces a significant amount of risk. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Generally, the best way to use a cloud service is to use it to replace something that you're doing in-house already that is cheaper and more effective to do externally. Now, different types of cloud, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I do want to focus on this one because there's a lot of misunderstanding about private. What a lot of people call private cloud is, yes, we have a cloud architecture hosted in our own data center. In this particular book, when we talk about a private cloud service, we're talking about a service that is provided by an external cloud service provider, but it is a one-to-one relationship. So they are providing a cloud service to you that is tailored to meet your specific needs. Now, they're doing that, and the reason they're doing it more cheaply than you can is because they're using a pool of resources, and those resources can be used to provide other services to other clients. But to you, what you're getting, it is dedicated and customized to what you need. And that is the only type of cloud service that is easily, not easily, but that is customized to your particular organization, that is unique to your organization. In all other cases, the cloud services you're using are shared. They are common. There are commonly used commodities that are used by a number of organizations. Public hybrid is where you may combine a cloud service with an in-house service. And multi-cloud is a particular type of technology where you can perform the same workload using multiple cloud service providers. And there are tools and methodologies which enable you to do that. In this book, we cover all of these. Also, very important to know, it's difficult sometimes to realize that when you're talking to a cloud service provider, they may not actually be a cloud service provider themselves. They may be a broker. They may be a partner of a cloud service provider. And it's very important when dealing with someone who is representing themselves as a source of cloud services that you know whether they are in fact the actual provider of those cloud services, or whether they are simply a broker or a managed service provider who is acting on your behalf. So the important thing about this slide is that every type of cloud partner, and they're very specialized, every type of cloud partner has a different set of services that they offer. So a reseller simply resells services. A broker does the same, but they're acting on your behalf. And may even go into the negotiation if there is a negotiation. Consulting and advisory companies will provide the full suite, from helping you define your cloud strategy to optimizing that strategy. Now this is very important because a lot of organizations fall into the trap of thinking that the cloud service provider will help them define their cloud strategy. Amazon Web Services, for example, can you help me define my cloud strategy? AWS themselves, as a cloud service provider, will not do that. They will provide you with a set of standardized, commoditized services. If you want to get consulting to create your cloud strategy, there is a separate business unit within Amazon that will do that. But it's not the same business unit as the ones who provide the cloud services. And you will find that you will need two different contracts in order to work with that cloud service provider, one with the cloud service provider's professional services organization and one for the cloud services themselves. So this is a common mistake that is made by organizations going to the cloud. Hey, Amazon, you're a cloud service provider, or hey, Azure, you're a cloud service provider. Come and define my strategy for me. It's not as easy as that. So be very clear, you will have to work with different types of organizations through this journey. And just for reference, of course, this is the only marketing we'll provide, is Synexios plays in this space. We're a consulting and advisory firm. The other thing to notice is that the cloud journey is not linear. Very often we think, well, we're going to start with cloud, we're going to define our strategy, then we're going to define our requirements, then we're going to get the cloud service, then we're going to onboard it. And in some cases that happens, but particularly the first time that you use cloud services. But what you find is that cloud services are so easy to onboard and change that very often we're going through this journey multiple times. And we're going through the same journey for multiple services, but we may skip some steps, or we may go back and repeat some steps. So this journey is not linear. You'll see here there are feedback and feed forward loops here. So typically we do go through a journey. We will explore, define a strategy, we'll engage with the cloud service providers and their partners to find out what's available. We'll communicate our requirements to them, and we'll get an offer of some kind. And then we'll agree on what services now, when you define your requirements during the explore stage and during the engage stage, what you may find is that there were some things that were available that you didn't realize when you were putting those together. So when you meet with the cloud service partner, they'll tell you about new things. Oh, that means we have to go back and we have to revise our requirements. So it's not a very linear journey. It can happen very quickly, and it can be very volatile, I think is the right word. So this is also just something to recognize about cloud. It is important to have a defined journey. There are certain steps that you need to take, and that you should make sure that those steps are taken before you move to the next step. But you may have to repeat those steps, and they may happen very quickly. And there are some cases where you've done the due diligence for one cloud service and the same due diligence applies for another cloud service. So it's important to align this journey across multiple services. Okay, now let's look at the actual keys to cloud success. And you'll see on the slide, there's a little clock under the keys to cloud success. This, here at Synexius, we do nothing if add more value. And so the value add on this is this is my little technique. Actually, Mark and I developed this together to remind me that I have to be at this point in the presentation 25 minutes into the presentation, and we're exactly right. So there's a tip for you, those of you who are presenting very often. Include cues on your slides to make sure that you stay on time. So that's our one there, and a little bit of added value for you, nothing to do with the cloud. So what are the keys to achieving successful cloud use? The first one is to have a strategy. And by the way, cloud first, it's not a strategy. Cloud first is an architectural guideline. Basically says if you're going to come up with a new service, before you start developing something in-house, look at whether it can be done on the cloud. Look at the level at which certain proprietary information needs to be part of the service, or whether it is more commoditized functionality. Can it be partly hosted in the cloud or fully hosted in the cloud? Cloud first is a design principle which enables you to ask those questions. It is not a strategy. And the reason I say that is because if you use that as a strategy, then pretty much everybody is going to dump everything into the cloud, even stuff that should never have been there in the first place. And to migrate it to and then back from the cloud is hugely expensive and not only expensive, but highly disruptive. So cloud first, great design principle, not a great cloud strategy. You need a formal strategy to move to the cloud. Now, where does that strategy fit? Let's have a look at strategy. So overall, we have this business strategy or an enterprise strategy, which tells us where our organization is going. And when I say business, I don't necessarily just mean commercial. This could apply also to government agencies and so on, nonprofits as well. It is the thing that your organization does. It is the purpose that your organization exists. What does it do to stay relevant to its stakeholders? That is the business strategy. As far as technology goes, there are two parts to that strategy. There is what is called the IT. We grew up with the IT strategy, which is what do we do in IT to support those business objectives and activities. But increasingly, that technology is being used directly embedded in the business itself, and has become known more and more as digital technology. And digital strategy is a business strategy which is based all or in part on the use of digital technology. And what we're finding is that the IT strategy, which tends to be more of a back office strategy, and the digital strategy, which tends to be more of a front office strategy, are growing closer and closer together. In some years, not too many years, 5 to 10 years, we estimate that the digital and IT strategy will overlap by between 80 and 100% in many organizations. They'll be one and the same thing. So they're growing together. The cloud strategy is really a component of your digital and IT strategy. It is, in effect, not really a strategy at all. It is a tactic. It says, if this is the strategy that you want to achieve, how can we use cloud to achieve that strategy? Now, whenever you ask that question, how can we use something to achieve something else? What you're saying is that something is tactical. So cloud strategies are fairly tactical. Now, they may not be tactical to the people who are managing cloud, but they are tactical to the organization as a whole. So it's very important that when you talk about strategies, cloud should not be the thing leading your organization. In other words, we don't go to cloud because we want our organization to go to cloud. We go to cloud because it will help us to achieve an organizational objective more effectively and more efficiently. It is therefore not an end in itself, but a way of achieving the objectives that are set in your business, digital, or IT strategy. So if you do not have an IT or digital strategy and you're embarking on the cloud, your cloud strategy should first put some form of IT strategy or digital strategy together. Now, you may want to call that the cloud strategy, but let's be very clear, not all digital, not all IT is going to be based in the cloud. A lot of it will be embedded in the business itself, in the hands of the employees and their customers. So remember that cloud services are standardized and commoditized. They're strategic for us as consumers, but they're not as strategic for cloud service providers. And this was a lesson I learned early on in the book. One of the statements we made was that cloud service provider relationship is strategic. Therefore, the cloud service provider should be part of your strategic planning process, and they should, if possible, be on your steering committee or governance team. That was very quickly blown out of the water. Cloud service providers provide a standardized service. It's like buying a book in a bookstore. You go to a bookstore, you take a book off the shelf, you pay for it. There is no such thing as going to a bookstore and saying to them, well, I'd like these 3 books, but I don't want to buy the books. What I want to do is I want you to take page 1 through 20 out of this book. I want you to take 35 to 50 out of that book, and I want you to take 100 to 200 out of that book, and I want you to put them together for me in a new book. It doesn't happen. It's not how we buy services in the cloud. It's off the shelf. You want it, you take it, you pay for it. You don't want it, you don't buy it, you do not use it. That's how it is. There is nothing strategic about that. I do not have a board member of Barnes & Noble sitting with me to guide my reading decisions. It's very unlikely that you will have an executive from AWS, Azure, or Google sitting on your board to advise you on your use of cloud. It doesn't happen that way. Now, there are exceptions, of course. If you're a huge multinational organization, that is the primary user of cloud services, you may very well have a strategic relationship with the cloud service provider. But the rest of us, pretty much, the relationship that we have with the cloud service provider is strategic to us, but it is not strategic to the cloud service provider. Forrester calls that the uneven handshake. So very important, have a cloud strategy, but understand that cloud strategy is for the use of commoditized cloud components. 1% of the time, you may choose to use something in the cloud that is highly innovative. For example, you may want to go into Google Labs and use some of the artificial intelligence capabilities there. It'll cost you. Sometimes they'll offer it as a promotion just to showcase their capabilities, but that is not the primary use of cloud services. So as far as cloud strategy goes, one of the things that we really need to understand is how we're going to use the cloud. And again, going into this, it's tempting to think, well, the cloud is the cloud and we're consumers, that you just use the cloud, right? No, actually, it doesn't work like that. What we found is that there are 4 very different ways of using the cloud. And what's really interesting is that these 4 ways are used at the same time in the same organization in many cases. So first of all, let's have a look at the way in which in which we determine what these 4 cloud uses are. First thing we looked at was, how do people use the cloud? And what we recognized is that there are some organizations that used it in a very standardized way. There are IT departments very often, and they're doing in the cloud what they've always done. So if they had a server farm in their data center, what they're using the cloud for is to replicate that server farm. And they're doing it because it's cheaper and easier. They don't have to manage the hardware. It's all there in the cloud. Their virtual devices, much easier. But essentially, they're doing exactly the same thing in the cloud that they were doing in-house. On the other side of the spectrum, you have groups of people in the organization that are using cloud services to be very innovative. For example, hey, how can we use the cloud to extend our customer engagement model and have customers engage with us directly using apps on their mobile phones? How can we go into new markets? How can we create digital products that we can deliver using the cloud? The building blocks, all very standard, but the way in which those building blocks are used, highly emergent and innovative. The second set of variables that we looked at was how cloud is managed. So again, on the one hand, we have very centralized control. Everybody has to come through one organization, maybe IT. You cannot get a cloud service unless you go through that particular office. Two, on the other hand, we have organizations that are completely centralized. Anybody can order any cloud service if they need it. And very often we have the same thing in the same organization, right? You have some components which can only be ordered through IT, but you have other components which anybody can order using a company credit card. Now, just a word here, I'm going to pause because in one of the posts this week on LinkedIn, I said, this can lead to cloud sprawl, right? Cloud sprawl is where there's just uncontrolled cloud usage and everybody's out there buying cloud services and using those services with company credit cards. And before you know it, you have no idea how much money is being spent on which cloud services. You have duplication, you have uncontrolled posting of sensitive data into public forums. This is the kind of thing that happens with cloud sprawl. Now, on the other hand, there is such a thing as good cloud sprawl. So good cloud sprawl is when you're able to allow groups in the organization to make decisions about using cloud as part of innovation to grow the business or to grow market share. And that's good. But at the same time, it's good sprawl, but there has to be some level of governance. Now, we're going to talk about governance a little bit later on because a lot of people think that governance equals control. Actually, control can be part of governance, but it's less about control and it's more about coordination. It's more about it's more about understanding what different groups are doing so that we can benefit from them more effectively. And it's also about preventing waste and duplication. So, good cloud sprawl, it's a good thing, equals, wide, autonomous and emergent use of cloud services, but with good governance. Now, let's put these two spectrums together and we'll see what we get. This is another little tip that I can give you if you want to really be a good consultant. Those of you who are consultants or want to be consultants, one of your basic skills is to create two spectrums and then be able to just turn one on the side and create a box. Everybody loves a box. So here we are, we've got a grid over here and we have 4 quadrants. Amazing. Let's have a look at what's in the quadrants. So here where there's standardized use, centralized control, there we're talking about standardized components. These are typically things like, those back office server farms, for example. Like for like replacement, what we're typically doing is we're modernizing, we're moving off legacy, we're moving into a more modern environment in the cloud. So it's cheaper, faster, more effective, and we're reducing technical debt. Now let's go to the next one, which is 2, in this case, standardized, but decentralized. In this case, we have IT acting as a broker. There are some centralized, standardized offerings, but product teams use those standardized offerings in different ways. And IT can act as a broker, or those groups can, in some cases, they're given very clear guidelines as to when they can go directly to the cloud service provider. The third group is centralized control, emergent and innovative. This typically, these are new solutions, and these are typically done in test environments. So if you have a lab or an innovation garage in your organization, that is typically what is happening over here. Very centralized control. It's a lab environment, very secure environment, controlled environment, but you're testing new features and functions. And then the fourth one is where you have emergent and decentralized. This is pretty much everybody going out there and pretty much doing all kinds of things in the cloud. Again, this could lead to bad cloud sprawl, or with the right governance, could be a very positive thing for your organization. Now, let's talk about value, because that's the third key. It's important to understand what value cloud is going to give you. To understand value, you have to understand, first of all, what are the positive effects, and those are measured in terms of what outcomes are we going to achieve, what costs will be removed, in other words, what cost savings are there, and what risks are we going to remove. And that tells us what the anticipated value is. Of course, anytime you do something new, you may introduce certain negative effects. There may be certain things you can do in the cloud and certain things you cannot do in the cloud. You may introduce costs of migration, for example, and you may introduce risks. The risk of learning new security tools and monitoring, for example. The end result of this is going to be value. Now, in the book, we cover this in quite a bit of detail. We actually talk about the kind of outcomes that you're going to support, which could be anything from increased performance to new business lines of business. We talk at length about the kind of costs that are removed. How do you achieve cost savings in the cloud? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. Then we talk about the kind of risks that you're going to remove. Affected outcomes, for example, how do you manage spend? Do you have the right skills? Are you able to comply with legislation in certain countries? That was a major issue in Europe with the cloud in the early days. What costs are you going to introduce? I've mentioned migration, developing APIs, etc. Very interesting, by the way. We assume that cloud service providers have all the application program interfaces that we need. Don't assume that at all. Many expect you to provide that and develop those yourselves. And then the risks that are introduced. We've mentioned some security, sprawl. Now, I want to say very clearly that we may introduce these risks and costs, but the really cool thing about the cloud is that the cloud incorporates all the tools that you need to manage these. They have extensive cost measurement, monitoring, and control tools. They have extensive security monitoring and response and reporting tools. The tools exist. Very often, the risk is us not knowing how to use those tools or not integrating those tools correctly into our own internal procedures. So let's talk a little bit about this whole thing of risk. In the book, we spend pretty much an entire chapter talking about managing cloud risk, and they're divided into 5 categories. There's governance and control, which is about how you use cloud services and how you authorize the use of cloud services. It's about understanding why people are using cloud services and what they're going to do with them and what the outcomes are that are anticipated and whether they're being held accountable to achieving those outcomes or not. That's what governance is about. It's not about how you control cloud. There's a small part of it that is that. It's about how you make decisions about who has access to cloud, what they can spend on cloud in pursuit of which business outcomes. So that's governance and control. We have security, again, very important part of moving to the cloud. It's very risky. Again, it's very important to differentiate. Security of the cloud is provided by the cloud service provider. They provide an inherently secure and resilient infrastructure and applications. What they do not provide is any control over how those are used. So we may find that the tools exist, but we still find that, for example, applications are not configured correctly. There are loopholes. Customers can get access to stuff they shouldn't be getting access to, and so on. And that very often has to do with the way in which the cloud is being used. So it's very important to note who is responsible for security of the cloud and who is responsible for security in the cloud. And that's usually us as consumers. How to manage service levels, and very often we're very unclear about what those service levels are. Remember that a cloud service provider will meet a service level agreement that is based on the technical performance of their service. They have no responsibility for achieving our outcomes. That's on us. How we use the cloud service, how that cloud service performs when we use it as part of something else, that's on us. And of course, that's not to say cloud service providers are perfect. They're not, as we found out this week, with major failures happening every now and again. But we also cannot ask them to take responsibility for things that they're not responsible for. Procurement and vendor management, again, very often we tend to assume that the cloud service provider has been around for long. They're doing it for all kinds of people. Therefore, what they're going to do is measure it for us. And very often that's not the case. Very often they're expecting us to do something. Very important for us to actually figure that out in the terms and conditions of services and any contracts that we have. And then the people and organization. There is a shift in responsibilities. There's just no doubt about it. When you start using cloud, it changes things. And it will change the way people interact with technology, and it will change the way in which they use technology. Therefore, it changes the way in which they work. Therefore, it changes the culture of the organization. There is no way around that. It's better to get ahead of that and plan for it rather than react to it. And right at the middle of all of this is cost. Because if you get any of these wrong, it has a cost implication, right? Not only directly in terms of how much you pay for the cloud service, but also in terms of the impact because of downtime or because of disruption to your business. And it could be very simple things, like you thought that change management, anything that you changed was in the contract, and then suddenly you get a bill for something which you requested a change for. You know, it could be as simple as that to anything to something like, you know, there was a security event because of some misconfiguration that we did, and we were expecting that the cloud service provider was supposed to do that, and that miscommunication led to a major outage of service. So very important in all of this, the next key is this shared responsibility model. In an in-house environment, the orange is everything that we as a consumer do. We're responsible for everything. And it's much easier to control the use of everything. So for example, cost. We have purchased a major server farm. We host it in-house. We only use 50% of the capability. So if there is a spike in demand, we can accommodate it. No problem. We're paying the same no matter what. Yes, maybe we're overpaying, but we don't have to pay extra every time there's a spike. Well, in the cloud, you know, basically you're moving that server's infrastructure as a service. That server is now in the cloud and you're paying based on utilization. And every time there's a spike in utilization, yeah, you are saving money as long as you were using it under the threshold that you were using in-house. But as soon as you exceed the threshold, you start paying additional. And so it's very important to recognize what you're responsible for and what the cloud service provider is responsible for, what you have to pay for, and what you have control over the cost of internally. Notice one little interesting thing on the slide up here. The service management piece in-house, we do all the service management, but here service management is split. And this becomes really interesting because basically what happens as soon as you move into the cloud, and it starts at the very first one, your service management function starts to split. So we find people who want to replicate every process they have internally in the cloud. And so they'll take something like problem management and they'll say, well, we do problem management in-house. We need to do problem management in the cloud. No, you don't. Problem management is the responsibility of the cloud service provider. It's very unlikely that they're going to invite you into their problem management meetings to discuss how they can improve their infrastructure and applications and so on. Very, very unlikely. So the best you can do is say, you know what, problem management belongs to them. We do incident, as far as we're concerned, incident management, there's an interface there. The problem management piece goes into the cloud service provider. We still have problem management for the pieces that are under our control. What is the link between those two problem management pieces? Incident management, right? So we have to start thinking differently. And this is one of the major shifts that has to happen in moving to cloud. IT people have to stop thinking like service providers and start thinking like customers. Just like they wanted their users to think of themselves as customers, we now have to think of ourselves as cloud users as the customer of the cloud service provider. So it's a difficult transition to make. As we go through, you'll see the shared responsibility model changes. And a shared responsibility model is something that exists with every cloud service provider. They each have their own version of this thing, but it tells you exactly what is your responsibility and what is my responsibility. Generally, it's used as a way to define security responsibilities, but you should make sure that you're applying the shared responsibility model to every aspect of what you do as an organization. Okay. And that comes down to aligning your operating model. So you have an operating model within your organization. It tells you what your capabilities are. It tells you what your value streams are. It tells you how you deliver those value streams. It tells you who your partners are. It tells you every component that you need to be able to operate as an organization. The cloud service provider has a technical architecture, and it's important to align these two. If you don't align them, then that's where the failures happen. That's where the overspend happens. That's where the deficiencies happen. So it's very important to make sure that you understand your own operating model before you move into the cloud. And that's a common mistake that's made. It's like, well, the cloud will just tell us what the operating model is. And there's this term that's thrown around, cloud operating model. Yeah, as long as you've got a cloud operating model, you're okay. No. If your cloud operating model does not map directly to your organization's operating model, you can be in a world of hurt. So very important that that alignment takes place. And the final piece of this presentation about the keys to using cloud and successfully is this. It's the flower. And some of you who have heard this before will know this as the it's the map of service co-creation. Basically what it says is, if you understand what you are looking to achieve, and you can map that back to your operating model and your capabilities, you can really be more successful in the cloud. And the way it works is this. You take a look at this flower and you say, okay, well, we've got operational excellence. That's what we want to achieve. We want to be efficient. We want to be fast. Okay, if you want to do operational excellence, here are some, and because this is an ITIL book, here are some ITIL practices which you're going to need to have in place. So for problem management, what is your responsibility? What is the cloud service provider's responsibility? For incident management, for change enablement, for whatever. And it doesn't have to be limited to IT service management. It could be any aspect of your business. It is important, if you want to achieve operational excellence, that you're able to map out what is the capability that's required, who in our organization is responsible for it, and who in the cloud service provider is responsible for it. Now, you don't have to do all of those petals in the flower all at the same time. For example, if you're a bank and you're doing a back office cloud solution for an internal consumer, You're probably not worried about strategic adaptability. Consumer experience, indirectly, but definitely operational excellence, governance and control, primarily, if you're a bank, very, very important. So the subset of capabilities that you're going to be mapping is going to be very different to that online retailer who is looking to use the cloud as a basis for delivering their new products and services. Now, the flower that you saw is part of something bigger. And basically all we're saying here is that do not be afraid, because there is all kinds of guidance out there to tell you what you need to do if your main objective is consumer experience, if your main objective is strategic adaptability. And that comes from the cloud service provider, it comes from your own organization, and it comes from industry best practices. And achieving that enables you to build value. So I'm going to end the presentation at that point, and we're going to stop for questions. If you would like to get in contact with me or with Mark, here are our details. Please do LinkedIn connect to us. We're always active on LinkedIn, and we love to be connected with our colleagues, clients, friends, etc. Please do join us. Thank you for your time, and we're going to stop for questions.
Yeah, great. So I think there's a couple of questions that have been coming through during the conversation, which would be good if you can answer. In the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute everyone. So, well, not unmute everyone, but allow you to unmute yourselves if you would like to ask a question directly. So, David, the first question we had was from Nicola, who said, who is responsible for the cloud strategy, business or IT or both?
It depends what the primary use case is. I would say if all you're anticipating is using it as a modernization or a replacement for what's happening in the back office, then it's an IT strategy. However, the cloud is increasingly in use across the entire organization, and therefore it should be a reflection of your business strategy and your digital strategy. So it would be both, ideally.
Thanks, Dave. We have a second question from Nicola, which was, do you talk in the book about how to select a cloud provider or implementation partner? And also regarding strategies, do you have a single strategy for each provider that you're purchasing from, or are there multiple strategies when you use multiple different providers? I think that was the question, Nicola.
Right. So, sorry, the first part of that question was?
Do you talk in the book about how to select cloud providers and implementation partners?
Yes, we do. We do talk about selection, talk about how to set requirements, and we talk about how to evaluate those requirements. Also understand that selecting a cloud service provider, in many cases, you're working off a standardized service catalog. There's no RFP, there's no negotiation. It's just like, well, this is the service. So we talk about that. We talk about the difference between standardized services and non-standard services like migration. The second part of the question is, do we have one or many strategies? The answer to that question is whatever makes it easy for you. The point is, a strategy is strategic to the person who manages or governs that area. It is not strategic to the person one level above in seniority or governance, right? So a cloud strategy may be strategic to the people managing cloud. But then you may find that you've divided your organization into different cloud service providers for different parts of the business or for different regions, for example. And you may need to have a different strategy for each of them. But the important thing is, all of those strategies would have to be based on the original top level cloud strategy. So you nest your strategies within each other. You cannot have strategies that are disconnected and that are trying to achieve opposite things in the same organization.
Great, thanks, Dave. From Yasa, we have the question, how do you segregate between cloud service provider responsibilities and customers' IT responsibilities, especially on security and service management? And I ventured there that you could probably do a whole webinar just on that section.
A whole series on that question. And I think that, again, the best thing to say is that you need to be very clear about how the cloud service provider sees their responsibilities. They have a very clear understanding of where the responsibilities start and end. And that's always your starting point. There's not much negotiation in this, by the way. You can negotiate with the managed service provider who is procuring cloud services and managing them on your behalf, but you cannot negotiate that with the cloud service provider. And so, and very often this is not a matter of that you can even tie down in a contract, because the terms and conditions of service are in the service catalog. And so you have to understand very clearly. Now, if the service catalog is not very clear, then it's a matter of dealing with whatever sales entity you're dealing with in that organization to clarify that. But this is on you. It is not on the cloud service provider. It is on us as consumers to define what that division of responsibilities is. They've already defined what they think it is. So if you're not happy with it, you have a choice. Either ask them to change it, which is unlikely, unless enough of you ask them to change it, or look somewhere else.
Thanks, Dave. We have so yes, I hope that answers the question for you. Gerardo, we have a question from you, which is, do you have any guidance on how to extend current, probably immature, governance practices to this shared operational scenario, where you're also moving forward and backwards in the cloud roadmap or journey?
Yeah.
If value creation was hard in the on-premise world, then it's going to be much more complicated with having some or a lot of cloud in your environment.
It is probably the primary question that everybody should ask before they move into the cloud, and yet it is the question that is asked last, usually after you move to the cloud and it doesn't work too well. And then suddenly we realize, oh, well, maybe we should have thought about that. Maybe. So the guidance is this. You should only be moving into the cloud. If you're uncertain of where things are, only move things into the cloud that you already know how to manage. It's the same thing with any outsourced arrangement. Remember, cloud, you are sourcing commodities from the cloud. Commodity by definition is something which is clearly understood, easy to manage, something which you already know exactly how it works within your organization. And those are the things you should move into the cloud. And so my guidance is, until you get to that point, don't move it to the cloud. There's one exception to this, and that is if you want to do something new in your organization and you do not currently have that capability, but that capability is offered by a cloud service provider, you can. That is the one exception. That is when you introduce something from the cloud into your organization without knowing how to manage it from the beginning. And the idea there is that you are using it greenfield, and you're basically learning what needs to be done before you implement it. But other than that, do not move into the cloud until you're certain you know what you're moving. And even simple stuff like storage. Storage is an easy thing to move in the cloud because the cost per gigabyte is so cheap. But unless you move your data governance along with your storage costs will spiral out of control because people will duplicate data. They'll put things in real-time retrieval services that should be archived and stuff like that. You have to have discipline that is aligned with that. And sorry, I'm going to just add one point to this, and that is what many IT groups do is they maintain control of the costs and governance, which they never should have had control of in the first place. Data governance, for example. And so cost, for example, they maintain the centralized IT budget. Well, if you're moving to the cloud and it's a pay per use, you should show clear cost transparency to make sure that the unit who's consuming that understands what they're consuming and how much they're paying for it. And if you don't have the capability to do that today, it's going to be very difficult for you to explain overspend on budgeted cloud services. So these are some of the things that have to be put in place. So Gerardo, again, we could have spent a whole series on that question alone.
We have, apologies if I say your name incorrectly. Wajahat, you had your hand up a second ago, and I wondered if you would like to perhaps ask your question to Dave.
Yes, dear. Thank you so much. I just want to talk further about, I'm from Middle East. So right now we have a lot of discussion going on the data localization and the data privacy, and the local laws about the data are coming, which is very much challenging for us before acquiring any cloud service, and specifically for the government for sure. So a cloud provider who does not have a footprint in Middle East, specifically, let's say I'm from Saudi Arabia. So how should we handle the localization factors? I just gave you an example of data privacy, but there are many other regulations going on from regulators and all that. So I know it's a very broad question, but you can justify.
Yeah, and thank you for that question. This is about compliance, and it's about legislation. It is something the European community went through some years ago, and they're still going through it in terms of where private data and personally identifiable data can be held, and the fact that cloud services can be provided from anywhere. So, and again, I know in the Middle East, a lot of organizations are using cloud services based in the US or elsewhere. And what governments are saying is that's not acceptable. The footprint and data has to be stored locally. Now, there's two things that happen as a result of that. The first thing is your economy of scale gets reduced, right? Because if you can put everything in one place, you can share those pools of resources, infinitely. But when you have to start dividing them up into smaller groups of customers, the economies of scale gets lost. And so potentially the price of those cloud services tends to escalate. But nonetheless, it is still very often more economical to do it that way than to do it in-house in many cases. But it does make the market a little bit more limited. It's not as competitive. But in terms of compliance, what has had to happen in countries where legislation has been introduced about where data may be held, for example, is that the cloud service provider is required to provide a certificate of compliance to that legislation. Now, for example, in the Middle East, where there are a number of countries, it may be very difficult for them to apply for certification in each of those countries. What they may tend to do is provide a certification and then provide an equivalency statement, which says, we comply with this standard. We understand that every country may have a different standard, but this is the standard we comply with, and it is equivalent to these aspects of these standards. So they may actually do it in one of those ways. But as far as legislation goes, they are required to provide a certificate of compliance to legislation in areas where they do business. The issue comes where you have uncontrolled use of cloud services and you have users in the organization who are able to buy cloud services and circumvent that situation. And in that cases, governments, for example, have been shutting down various services. So, for example, we were on a podcast this week, and they were using StreamYard, and I think it was in Dubai. One of the participants couldn't participate because Dubai had blocked StreamYard for specifically this reason. So, you have to be very clear when you are embarking on a cloud journey not to invest in a cloud service that could potentially be blocked because of non-compliance. And that means understanding and being able to forecast which way legislation is going to go and how the government in a particular country is going to enforce that legislation, which is which is in many cases trial and error. So again, something to think about. If something is absolutely critical for your business, be very careful about where you put it in the cloud. I don't know if that answers the question, Wajhat. If it doesn't, please please elaborate.
They were absolutely. There were 2 great points about certificate of compliance and the equivalency. It's a great workaround solution for the time being. And then,
Right.
of course, knowing the local legislation is very important. I think that there is a question, extension of the same question, which is about. We know that there are legislations. We know the cost factor. We know the overall blockage. Your next books in TSO, or is there any roadmap, or is there any existing book which can help us in supporting the localization aspects? I understand that our ITIL books are very general and loosely written, but are we going to touch such type of topics somewhere?
I would hope we do. At this stage, there isn't one because the cloud book has just been released. And as you say, it is a very generic set of guidance, and it's intended to be generic. The supplementary and supporting guides will be written. And essentially what will happen is, as people like yourself provide this feedback to Axelos, they then put that in a backlog, and they find people who are willing to write about that. It may be as short as a white paper, it may be as long as a supplementary guide, and it may even evolve into an extension module. But it's very important that your feedback is heard by Axelos. If you're not sure, just send it to me. I can forward it to my contacts there. I'd be very happy to do that.
Thank you. That serves the purpose of my question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So I'll just drop David's email address in the chat there if you want to reach out to him. As in alignment with that, Emma had a really good question, and so in terms of, he said, why do you think we have to have a publication for this separately at this time? Why was it not part of the existing publications such as Digital and IT Strategy?
A very good question, and one which I can answer with a little bit of authority, and that is because digital technology is broader than the cloud, is the first answer. And secondly, because there was a lot of discussion going on in digital strategy about where the cloud plays, and we realized that if we had to include it in the digital and IT strategy book as a subject, it would have made the digital and IT strategy book too long. And so the decision was made to separate it out into a separate book. So Digital and IT Strategy was published 1 year ago, and this book was published last month. The idea also, by the way, secondary reason was that Axelos wanted people who were not familiar with ITIL to have access to guidance specifically about the cloud. Bearing in mind that there are a lot of people who are coming into the cloud world as cloud architects and out of the back office or development teams who are not ITIL qualified, who may not have had exposure to things like the Digital and IT Strategy book. And instead of forcing them to read through that, I say forcing, of course, I think it should be an absolute pleasure. But instead of forcing them to read through that, they felt it was important to provide a guide that was was targeted at that particular audience. So there were a number of reasons, but you're absolutely right. It is 100% part of your digital strategy. And really, I see it as an extension of that book.
Great stuff. Thank you, David. And I think, anyone who's actually read through Digital IT Strategy or has actually taken the exams in that will find the cloud book makes a lot of sense, and you can see a lot of the parallels and how they really does fit together, and you can see that common thread there. So thank you, David, for that. Okay, I think that we are through all of the questions. I see Wajhat still has his hand up. Is that just a hangover, or do you still have?
It's a hangover.
Okay, no problem. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
any
Yeah.
further questions. But thank you very much, David. I hope everyone found it informative. If you would like to find out more, discuss further, please reach out to either myself or David via LinkedIn or via email or our website, indeed.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
everyone. Thank you.